Going to go into the third part of our show today, which is going to focus on position battles. And then we're going to wrap things up after that by ranking the position groups on defense. When you look at the position battles, some of this stuff we've already talked about at length, but I think I want to zero in on a little bit. And the first one is linebacker. We know Jack Kaiser is going to play. He's probably going to start somewhere. And Jack Kaiser is another interesting player because if you look at his production last year, he was a very productive player on a per snap basis. And I'm going to give you some examples of what I'm talking about. Last year, Jack Kaiser tied for the Notre Dame team lead in tackles, in solo tackles, and he was third in total tackles. The guy he tied with in solo tackles was J.D. Bertrand, who had 647 snaps played. And Howard Cross, who had more tackles than he had 610 snaps. Jack Kaiser only played 354 snaps last season. If you look at his per snap production the last 2 seasons, he's been a very productive player. You look at Jack Kaiser 2 years ago, had 5.5 tackles for loss and only played 338 snaps. That's really good production. You're talking about a guy that's around 10 tackles for loss over the course of the season if he played the same number of snaps that the other starters played. But that's the rub with Jack. He's not really a 600 snap per year guy. He's not really a line him up at Mike or Will guy. So to me, even though, Ryan, there's only 2 spots open for a starting job, theoretically, what those 2 spots are is not really, I can say it's Will and Rover or Mike and Will. I think it's who are the 2 best linebackers, and then who those are is going to determine where Jack plays. And here's what I mean by that. If the guys that step up this spring are Drake Bowen and either Jalen Sneed or Jaden Osbury, and those guys are like they're Wills, then Jack can play where he's been, and you know how good he can be at that position. But if it's Jalen Sneed that steps up, and let's say, Kingston and Jaden Osbury don't really play like starters, then you may, and Jalen Sneed's just not really an inside guy. He's 219 pounds. You feel more comfortable with him at Rover where you're playing the bowl game, then Jack's got to play Will. And I think now that hurts you at that one returning spot. Now I think that one returning starter isn't going to be as good as he was a season ago, at least on a per snap basis. And so to me, all 3 positions are going to be impacted by who steps in and earns starting jobs at the 2 open spots. That's what's going to make this position battle fascinating, Ryan. Is it a Mike that steps up? Is it a Will that steps up? Is it a Rover that steps up? And the other part of it too is at no position other than linebacker can you literally say every scholarship player, except for the guy coming back from a 2-year mission, is going to go into the spring pushing for a starting job. I think that's true because we're going to talk about Drake Bowen and Jaden Osbury and Jalen Sneed. But I think there's no way I'm discounting Kingston Viliama-Asa making waves this spring. And you know who else I'm not discounting this spring? Preston Zinner. Like, I think he's probably your biggest guy of the returners, and he can run too. So that's what makes it so fascinating because nobody can take a day off because of how deep and how talented this group is, but it still remains an unknown. So when I talk about position battles, Ryan, I think on defense, it has to start at linebacker. That's going to be the biggest thing that for me that I'm going to be looking at this spring is who steps up and forces their way in the starting lineup at linebacker. Because you know this, Ryan, somebody's going to win the battle, but winning the battle isn't always a good thing because it may just be of all the guys that struggled, you were the least bad, right? You needed to be this guy forced his way into the starting lineup. This guy forced his way in the starting lineup, and he was just too good not to start. That's what you needed to be. And hopefully, I'll speak for myself. My hope is that whoever the 2 guys that merge as the dudes are both inside guys, because I want to leave Jack Kaiser right where he has been the last couple of years, because in that role, he's a really good football player. I've seen him started inside linebacker twice, North Carolina 2 years ago and Central Michigan last year. And in either of those games, I thought he struggled in both of those games as a pure inside guy. Once North Carolina figured out where he was in the first half, they just started isolating him with tight ends and crossing routes. And Central Michigan just ran right at him in the first half of the game last year. And so to me, that's going to be a big thing is you want to keep him where you are but that's going to be determined by how good, who steps up at those other two spots.
Yeah. I would also say, like, how many guys do step up, right? Because, like, we're talking about two, but if, let's say, one other guy is just like, let's say hypothetically, Drake Bowen and Jaden Osbury are just play out of their minds, right? Where you're just like, those guys have to play. But then Kingston, you're just like, but he's playing really good too. Where now you're just kind of like, yeah, Jack, you're technically you're the starting rover, but like also might be able to just kind of move you around a little bit and be a little bit of a Swiss Army knife. Because honestly, that's what I think Jack's best role is. Like, I don't think his best role is just playing one spot all the time. I think that he's a good athlete that you can use, especially as an attack style player. Like, his
Yep.
best trait for me is when he's at rover and he's blitzing off the edge as a free blitzer and being able to close the gap. Because that's one thing that I think is a common misnomer about Jack Kaiser is that he's not a really good athlete. I mean, I think that kid can very. I mean, we saw in the with his interception this past year, right? Where you're just like, that kid can move in space,
Yeah.
right? Like after the catch. So I think that as many linebackers that can step up as possible will really potentially make the operation a little bit different in the sense of what are the different roles that they're going to play first and foremost, but what are the different alignments as well, right? Like you can mix and match different skill sets and be able to utilize their skill sets to the highest level of advantages. I mean, I can see a world where you're playing against a spread team where like, hey, now we're going to get Jack Kaiser inside with Jay Nosberry for a ton of reps, guys that are a little bit more used, or Jalen Sneed for guys that are a little bit used to playing in pass coverage a little bit more. I mean, there's so many possibilities, and I think that we kind of understand what the possibilities are this spring to
Yeah.
kind of get a little bit of glimpse of that.
Yeah. Is there anybody at linebacker, Ryan, that you're more than it? Like, is there one guy more than any other that you're just like, I really hope that guy breaks out? For me, it's Jaden Osbury. There's a level of, I kind of expect Drake
Mm-hmm.
to do a certain level of thing. I kind of expect Kingston to show but to me, Jaden Osbury is the wild card. If Jaden Osbury steps up this spring, and I've heard from some sources that he's had a very good offseason, he's the wild card because he might be the most natural will on the roster, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think for me, it would probably be Jalen Sneed, just because I think that Jalen Sneed brings so much versatility potentially on the second level. I mean, you don't really have a guy that I could say because I don't think he's a full time Will all the time, but a guy that can play Will at times, a guy that could be a dime linebacker, a guy that can also play rover, a guy that could be a sub package rusher at times. Like that's just a really valuable thing to have. And honestly, like he athletically is about as gifted as anybody on the roster. The question about Jalen, it's always been the question is, is he comfortable enough in the defense? Can he process fast enough? Can he become a more just kind of not as much a reactive player as a proactive player and be able to see things a little bit quicker in just his processing abilities? If he can, then he's a Swiss Army knife, man. You know, like what they tried to do with Maris this past year, especially where they're line him up as a sub package rusher a ton. I mean, even in 2022, I think that Jalen Sneed could be a just a weapon on the second level, and I think that he is a guy that can kind of unlock possibilities because I think I have more certainty, in my opinion, that Drake Bowen and Jaden Osbury will be ready to play linebacker at a higher level than Jalen. But Jalen has that ultimate wild card of like you have to account for that kid. You have to be like, where the heck is Jalen Sneed on any
That's it
given
right
play?
there,
And that's
Ryan.
like mismatch potential. Yep.
You're a defensive guy, right? So you're
Yeah.
looking at this from a defensive standpoint. I'm an
Sure.
offensive guy.
Yep.
Having a guy that can run like that and you never know where he's going to line up
It's
could be
terrifying.
huge.
Yeah.
For a team, because one thing that Al Golden did a really good job with last year, in my opinion, was the
Mhm.
ability to use so many different personnel groupings. His
Right.
ability to bring sub packages to the college game last year was really impressive. And that's part of the thing of the unknown of, okay, can he do that with a younger group? Because to your point, Jalen Sneed can come at you from 7 different ways if the light goes on, because there's no doubting the athleticism. But there's a
No.
reason. I'm going to read this to you, Ryan, and you're gonna know exactly why this happened because you studied the film. But here's what I wrote. I published a linebacker breakdown, spring preview for the linebackers before, right? Like actually at the beginning of the show. And
Okay.
here's a stat that I had for Jalen Sneed. In the first 4 games, they forced the issue with him being a rotation guy. He averaged 24 snaps in those 4 games. 24
Okay.
snaps is what he averaged. Okay.
Mhm.
So that's like 96 snaps, right?
Yep.
Over the next 7 games, he played a combined 72 snaps. And then
Yeah.
he played 64 in the last 2. And the reason why is because he was athletic. You could see the sideline to sideline speed was outstanding. The twitchiness was there, but he was constantly missing tackles and he was constantly hitting the wrong gaps. And it was like, we can't count on him to do this job. It's
Right.
the mental part with Jalen. It's the focus part with Jalen. If that light goes on and he is more assignment correct with that
Mhm.
athleticism, Ryan, I can bring him off either edge. I can bring
Yep.
him up the middle. I can
Mhm.
drop him into coverage. I can put him out in space. And you
Yep.
can do so many things with him. And as an offensive coach, that's a nightmare. It's a nightmare of how do I prepare for this guy? Because one snap he's coming off of my backside, the next snap he's dropping hook curl to the field. Like, what do I do with that guy? So, as an offensive coach, guys like that can be absolute nightmares. They really can. But he's
Yes.
got to figure it out, man. But to your
Yep.
point, that's he might be the biggest. You used the word enigma earlier for Jordan Patelho.
Yeah, he's
I
an
think the
enigma too.
biggest enigma they might have is Jalen Sneed this season.
And I know he's only entering his third year, so it's not like this is the end, last season of Jalen Sneed potentially, but you are hitting a little bit of a time now where it's like if the light doesn't come on soon, there's going to be some guys that might pass you up pretty
Yeah,
quickly here, right? And because he's going to get an opportunity to play, like there's no doubt about it. He's a junior. He's played some football the last couple years. He's an experience. He's one of the older guys in the room now. But ultimately, like Kingston's coming, man. And then
right.
this offseason, even after the spring, like Bodie Cahoon's coming and Teddy Rizak are coming and the linebackers in 2025, they're gonna be coming. Like you're running out of time here. And that's not even
Right.
counting the Drake Bowen, Jaden Osbury, Preston Zinter class into that equation either. Like they're coming, man. They're coming. So if you're Jalen, this is a massive offseason for you, but a massive spring to start it off because there's nothing guaranteed here, man. Like either you flourish or you're probably going to get buried
Probably,
on the
yep.
step chart a little bit. Like it is a make or break year for Jalen, a make or break off season for Jalen Sneed, in my opinion. I think it is.
Ryan, I'll say this too. Jalen
Yep.
Sneed, his first 2 years, has played a lot more football than Jeremiah Wusu played his first 2 years.
Sure.
Hopefully that benefits him as he
Yep.
goes into year three.
No doubt.
And we'll see if it does. Position group number 2 that there's a battle, Ryan. We don't need to talk too much about it because we've already talked about it a little bit, but it is a very important battle, and that's who is going to replace Cam Hart. Now,
Right.
this is what I brought up in my show, Ryan. So I'm going to kick it to you because I've already kind of covered this. I want to get your thoughts. To me, it's not so much will it be Christian Gray or Jaden Mickey because they're both going to play. But this is why this battle is important because who wins the job and to what degree is going to have a major impact on how you structure your coverage. Because if it's a 50-50 thing, then you're going to have a lot more multiple looks in coverage because Jaden Mickey's just not a guy you're going to go play cover one with all day. If Christian Gray wins the job and he's the 70 to 80% guy at corner, then that's going to impact how you cover a team. If Jaden Mickey wins the job, then you're not going to be able to play as much man you had in the past. You're going to have to do things a little bit differently. So to
Yep.
me, the reason this matters is because we just kind of chalk it up to, well, they're both going to play or they're both good, and they are. But
Right.
who steps up as the guy there is going to have a pretty big impact on how this team structures its coverages next season. When you
Sure.
talk about Christian Gray versus Jaden Mickey, because they're not similar players, they really
No,
are.
they're very different. I mean, physically than a lot different. Obviously, Christian's taller, he's longer. Jaden's a little bit more built to the ground. Jaden Mickey is more of a I mean, like his best attribute is like if I was just a cover two heavy team that just let him fire back to the line of scrimmage, like he's excellent at that. I
He'd
mean, I
be a
think you remember
dude
the
in Bob
Pittsburgh game
Diaco's
last year.
defense. A
Right.
dude in that defense. Yeah.
It's funny. I mean, he has. I think he's probably a little bit more of a gifted athlete, but like there's some comparisons to Julian Love. Like he has some of that Julian Love ish vibe where it's just like you just want him to flat foot and read downhill and be able to make plays on the football. I mean, you saw it against Pittsburgh, right, where he had the interception. He should have had two more in that football game potentially. Like
He could have had two
it's
pick
wild.
sixes in that game, Ryan. I mean, he was
He
close.
could have.
He was
He could
close.
have. And you love Jaden Mickey because he is super aggressive and violent as a football player as well. He'll stick his nose in the run game. That's why I think a lot of people always have said, and I'm included in that. You have been too, I believe, that he would probably be a really good nickel if you want him to play him there because he's not afraid to fit against the run and he's aggressive and he's good coming down to the line of scrimmage. And there's a lot of attributes that I think kind of play there. But you're absolutely right. I mean, Christian Gray you just say, even though there's going to be some, I'm sure there's going to be some growing pains at some points in the season as a first year starter if he wins it, but you just say, dude, lock up, go ahead, do your thing, right? Ton of man coverage. Jaden, you do have to be a little bit more mix and match
Yep.
type of feel, right? Like you do have to be a little bit more, I don't even want to say creative. It's not overly creative, but like, are you going to do combo coverages,
You're going to
right?
have to
Where you're
protect them more. Simple as
right.
that. I mean, he
But
is going to bite
yeah,
on slant and goes. Just
yes.
that's his nature.
Yep.
And you don't want to take that away from him necessarily because that's what makes him get pick sixes and come up and blow up screen games and things like that.
Mhm.
But that means you've got to structure to your point, that you've got to do your coverages to the point where you're going to have like last year their field safety was Xavier Watts.
Yeah.
Xavier came down a lot.
Mhm.
You're not going to be able to use him that way if Jaden Mickey as much. You may have to think about maybe putting him to the boundary more because
Well,
your field safety is going to have to play more help
yeah.
defense, or your nickel might have to if that's the case.
I would say this too is that I obviously Notre Dame likes to do the boundary field thing for the corners to specialize there, but if you have Christian Gray as your starting corner opposite Benjamin Morrison, you can almost be interchangeable, man. Like you don't have to just throw Christian Gray into the field
Yeah,
all the time. Like he can last in the boundary with the speed that he has, with the ball skills he has, with the length he has. Like
yeah,
he could last over there if he wanted to. So I think that that will be very interesting to see how they mix and match, and then also that's another thing on Al Golden's plate, like to
mhm,
understand like who's in the game. And now I have to be a little bit more coverage versatile in this certain situation, where I could be a little
right,
bit more dependent on one structure versus the next. Like it's going to unlock a lot of possibilities. And then also, if both those guys do step up and they are dudes, both of them, then you could be even more versatile with like how you
yes,
utilize Clarence Lewis and a couple of those backups that
yeah.
are kind of more of swing guys. So a lot, I think, depends on that just from a coverage perspective, but also a rotational perspective, and also the depth, I think, could hinder on where they're even going to be potentially playing in certain instances.
I will say this too, Ryan. If
Yep.
Christian Gray is as good as we think he is, I think he wins that job. And if he wins that job, I think if you're a smart coach, I think Notre Dame is, they will find ways to use Jaden Mickey.
Yes.
And number one. Number two, I think that helps your linebackers a ton.
Hmm.
Because if you can just say, hey, we trust him to just go play man on the outside guy more, that gives your coverage structure more opportunities to make sure you can fit at either safety spot, which to me is going to help protect the linebackers a little bit more earlier in the year in the run game stuff. That's how
Absolutely.
you could limit some of those big plays in the run game because you don't have to be shooting your safeties out like this.
Yep.
You can be having them come down, whether you're playing cover 4, whether you're playing cover 1. There's more things you can do to protect your second level guys if you have a true, I'll say lockdown, but yeah, it kind of is though, right? It's that hey, you're going to go out there and we're going to put our guys against your guys and we can match up against anybody. If the light goes on for Christian Gray and he's the player we think he is, that also has a big impact on the other 9 positions because Ben's going to do his thing. The other 9
Right.
positions get impacted greatly because you can now use your safeties in a completely different manner, which now plays right into what a Don Schuler does well, which plays
Yes.
right into what Luke Talich plays well, which is going to
Yep.
play right into what I think Rod Hurd's going to be good at, and plays right into what Xavier is and allows you to protect your linebackers with how you
Yep.
run fit, in my
No
opinion.
doubt.
So that could have a huge, huge impact. Next one, Ryan, speaking of safeties, safety battle is going to be important. Now, this is one where you're not going to have a true decision made in the
Right.
spring because the guy that we anticipate being the starter opposite Xavier Watts is finished up his master's degree in Evanston, Illinois. That's Rod Hurd.
Yep. Yep.
But what the battle is going to be for is what's the pecking order for how they're going to challenge Rod Hurd in
Right.
the fall, but also who amongst that sophomore class forces their way into the rotation. That's
Yep.
part of the battle too. Don Schuler obviously is a guy we're going to talk about. Ben Minnick's the athlete. A guy that I have my eye on this spring is if his shoulder heals up and he's ready to go, and I'm told he will be, I am very curious to see what Notre Dame does with Luke Talich this spring. But a Don Schuler to me has to step up this spring and kind of become that dude.
Yep.
And I'm really curious to see what they do with Luke Talich because he could be an alley weapon, but he could also be a 6'4" center fielder with range. Very curious to see how he steps up this spring as well. But those two guys, especially for me,
Hmm.
big springs for those two guys. And I'm curious to see how they battle. How does one guy stepping up play off the other one and vice versa is going to be a very interesting part of the safety position battles.
Well, in the storyline section of the secondary, I mentioned that I think the sophomore class of defensive backs is going to be one that we're going to be watching intently, and that's majority because of the safety position right now. I mean, because I think the tools are tremendous, right? Like, I mean, first and foremost, we know Xavier Watts is going to be a starter, right? I was going to make a funny joke of like, and who's going to unseat Xavier Watts in his safety role? But obviously, we know that that's not going to happen. But we know that there is a safety position that is open. And you're right. There is an assumption that Rod Hurd's going to come here and he's going to be the starting safety and it's, he's going to play well and all those things. But there could be a shakeup this spring, man. Like if the light goes on for any one of the three you talked about, and I would say obviously Adon Schuler's the one that you talk about most to begin, but then Luke Talich isn't far behind if he's healthy, and then Ben Minnick obviously has a lot of athleticism to work off of as well. If the light comes on for one or two of those guys, you start to think of like, hey, this is a position battle now, man. Like you're not figuring out depth anymore. Like you are figuring out, can any one of those guys start going into 2024? And Rod Hurd just comes in and potentially be a rotational piece. I mean, like
Mhm.
those things are on the table because I
Or
think Rod Hurd's a,
co-starters, right? That's
exactly.
just,
Yeah.
hey, it's like they're interchangeable to a degree.
Well, and I would say that Rod Hurd from the film I've seen, I think he's a very very a good college safety. Like he's been very productive. He's a solid overall athlete. Like cool, we're good there.
More
But
athletic version of
also,
DJ Brown. You think that's
yeah,
fair?
yeah, that's fair.
Right?
Yeah. But I would also say that the three guys we just talked about, at least just from a athleticism and physical perspective, are more talented than Rod Hurd. They are. Like if you put him next to a Don Schuler, I would say Don Schuler is a better overall athlete than what Rod Hurd is. Now, obviously, you can't supplement the experience that Rod Hurd has, though. He's played a ton of football, and at the safety position that is just consistent of communication and being in the right spot so often, you can't duplicate that. Like that matters so much, that experience level. But if the light comes on for a Don this spring where you're just like, oh, okay, then you have an offseason position battle, which is healthy for the team. There's usually some people misconstrue this a little bit. Some people would be like, "Oh man, there's a safety battle that hasn't been decided before fall camp. Like that means that someone hasn't stepped up." No, it's the opposite in this instance. Of like, if a Don Schuler or Ben Minnick or Luke Talich show that they can be that guy, and then Rod Hurt comes in, that's called healthy competition right there, man, where you potentially are going to get the most out of your defensive unit. So I'm praying that we get one to two of those guys to show themselves this spring of like, hey, I can be the dude in 2024. I just need an opportunity. I'm hoping that that does happen because that is the most advantageous situation for the safety position moving forward.
So what you're saying is that you hope that when we start doing position battles in the fall, when we have the same
Okay.
conversation in the fall, that we're
Yep.
talking about safety being a battle, not like Rod Hurd's
Yes.
going to be the dude.
Who's the
Hopefully,
depth?
these young guys can
Yeah.
step up and provide depth. If we're
Exactly.
having that conversation, it means spring didn't go well. The hope
100%.
is that, hey, Rod Hurd's going to play, but is he going to be the starter or is he going to be a rotation guy? Like, does Rod Hurd replace DJ Brown or does
Mhm.
Rod Hurd replace Ramon Henderson? That's going to be determined in a lot of ways by what, to your point, you
Spring
see
looks
from
like. Yep.
Adon and Luke and Ben. That's going to
Absolutely.
be the key. Last
Yep.
one, Ryan, we're going to talk about is defensive end, and I'm gonna use this all encompassing.
Okay.
There's a starter battle going on at the field end position. It's more of a depth battle going on at Viper right now. But
Sure.
both I'm going to have my eye on. The one on defensive end, I'm not really don't care as much about
Okay.
because whoever starts doesn't matter to me. They're both going to play a bunch with
Right.
Josh Burnham and RJ Open. It's more
Mhm.
about how does RJ adjust and can Josh take the next step? And
Right.
then, of course, you've got the young players. Does the light go on for Tyson Ford? Does Aiden Goldbyra step up? Does Bryce Young have that spring? But the one to me, the impact for me is not so much the starter
Mhm.
battles at either end spot. It's the behind battles. Does Bubakar challenge Junior Tuilamaka? Does Aiden Goldbyra, Tyson Ford, or Bryce Young, in whatever order you want to choose those guys, push Burnham and Rod Hurd, or excuse me, RJ Oben? That's the position battle from a depth standpoint that I think is going to have the biggest impact on this team outside of safety. Because with safety, it's more about, okay, are you going to have enough? Right? Where here, it's more about you're going to be good in the starting lineup. I mean, guys, you just had a top 5 defense with Jordan Patel playing the way that he did. Right? Right? You can overcome that. I think the field end is at worst going to be what it was this past season. I don't see it being, like here, Ryan, maybe slightly better. I mean, it's going to be similar to what it was last year. The difference is can some of those guys take jumps and make that better from the starting standpoint, but more so, who were the young guys that kind of announced their presence with authority this offseason? Is it
Yep.
Bubakar? Is it
Mhm.
Bryce Young? Is it Dyson Ford? Is it Aiden Gobira? Or is it a couple of those guys? Because I'll say this, there's no defensive lineman whose breakout this spring has a greater impact on this football team than Bubakar Traore, in my opinion, if that breakout happens. Because
Right.
if the breakout happens there, you have a 6'4", 80. I was told when he signed, Ryan, we were told he has a plus 84-inch wingspan.
Was it 84? That's wild.
84.
That's wild.
And that's, for perspective, that's a greater wingspan than Blake Fisher or Joe Alt. Now, if they're
That's almost 2 inches more than Joe Alt for
right.
context.
Now,
Yeah.
if that's a little exaggerated, which some of those things can be, he's
Sure.
still an 80+ inch wingspan guy. You see it on film, Ryan.
Sure.
He's the kind of guy that if the light goes on, and I've used that expression a lot, which is part of my concern with his defense, if the light goes on for him, I don't know if there's a player on this entire defensive roster that can have a greater impact, even more so than Christian Gray, which I talked about, than him, because he brings, and Ryan, I know you're going to agree with this, he's a guy that if he the season he figures it out could be a 10+ sack guy. He's got
Yeah.
that kind of explosiveness on the edge, combined with he'll be over 240, that kind of length, that kind of twitch. And I'm talking about steps into a rotation role. I'm talking about
Right.
if he goes from here to here,
Mhm.
that's asking a lot. I don't expect it, but if it
Sure.
happens, he
Yep.
could have a bigger impact than anybody on the defensive roster, in my opinion, as
It's
far as just
possible.
changing how the look of this football team.
Yeah. I would say that last year, Al Washington did a tremendous job with a couple players in particular. I thought he got the most out of Howard Cross, and it took a massive step forward. I also think he did a tremendous job with Javante Jean-Baptiste. I thought he showed a lot of signs with Riley Mills as well. His pet cats this offseason are the Viper position and figuring out which of his big ends is his dude and letting the depth kind of figure its way out from there. I mean, there's a lot of talent there. I mean, if you're talking about recruiting rankings, people love recruiting rankings. You just mentioned a whole lot of 4-star recruits in there, right? A lot of top 250 type of dudes, a lot of top 150 type of dudes. There's a lot of talent there. Can Al Washington get the most of it? He showed a lot of pleasant signs of being that developer in 2023. Can he get some of those guys to break out in 2024 to take that next step? That would be big time for Notre Dame.
Going to be fun to watch, Ryan. Fun
It
to
is.
watch.
We are going to end this podcast, folks, in a second. We're going to rank the position groups coming into the spring. So we're going to talk defensive tackle, defensive end, linebacker, cornerback, safety. We're going to break that down here in a second. Before we do, though, please just do us a favor. Hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Hit that notification bell as well on YouTube if you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform. 5-star reviews are very much appreciated. And as always, go over to boards.irishbreakdown.com for the latest recruiting and team intel. We're going to rank positions defensively here next on the Irish Breakdown podcast.